Firstly, thank you so much to everyone for taking the time to join us for this webinar. It was put together by the Students and Workers Affairs Subcommittee of AIW, headed by Nkosazana. And she had this amazing idea, and she put this together, and she contacted our amazing speakers who I'll introduce in more detail later on. Just to, okay, wait. So just a few sort of like rules and other things before we start. Just a little bit of Zoom etiquette. Can everybody please keep their microphones switched off, especially when the speakers are speaking? And if you do have any, but we do want this to be a very interactive space. So if you do have any questions, or if you do have a point that you would like to discuss further, then please feel free to pop it in the chat box. We'll be reading that from time to time. Nishka, maybe you could help me with that. Just let me know when there's like comments in the chat box. Just unmute yourself so you could so we can chat about them. So yes, please feel free to have your cameras on, but if you don't feel comfortable having your cameras on, that's also perfectly fine. Please also note that we will be recording the session. We would like to make the session available to people after the webinar is done, because our aim is to pretty much try and reach as many people as we can so that people have access to this information. So please just be aware of that, especially if you do have your cameras on. The session is being recorded, and I hope that we have everybody's permission and everybody's okay with us recording the session. Like I said, if you have any questions, please use the chat box, or we will be having a specific, we have a time slot allocated to a questions and answer session towards the end of the webinar. So if you do have any questions and you don't feel comfortable putting them in the chat box, you can also then wait until the end of the webinar, and we'll then get to those questions. So sort of like the last 10 minutes of the webinar, we've allocated those for questions and answers. Also, please note that this is a safe space. What we are going to be discussing is a very it's a very sensitive topic for a lot of people. So we'd like to create a very safe space for people, and where people feel comfortable engaging with our speakers and comfortable asking our speakers for information that they might very well need. So, because as Nkosana has written, we do experience a lot of different kinds of trauma in our lives, and a lot of the times we don't really understand the full extent of the impact of that trauma on us, which is what makes this webinar really important. So please be mindful of that. So we're not going to tolerate any kind of insensitivity, any kind of hate. So yeah, so I'm just going to head straight into introducing our speakers for today. So first up we have Angie, who works for the WITS GEO, which is the Gender and Equity Office. If you guys don't know, WITS does have a Gender Equity Office. It's actually a place where if you are facing issues, especially when it comes to gender-based violence, you can contact them for help. But Angie will get more into that when she does her presentation. So she'll tell us a little bit about the role of the GEO, the services that they offer, and how you can reach out to them. So Angie has a very reputable career in social work, spanning over 25 years of experience, which is amazing. In both South Africa and the UK, she has provided social work services across multiple disciplines, and her fields of practice include, but they're not limited to, things such as trauma counseling and rehabilitation, specialist care for older persons, adults with physical disability, early child development, and youth development. She has a wealth of experience. She's brought valuable learning experience to the Social Work Academy community, having led and facilitated practicum training, assessments, and placement of future social workers in South Africa at top academic institutions, including WITS, UJ, and UNISA. The second speaker that we have is Amina. who is a psychologist. So she is a mental health and psychosocial support practitioner at the CSVR Trauma Clinic. She does hold a master's degree in community-based counseling psychology, and she's currently pursuing her PhD at WITS, which is amazing. She has clinical experience working with torture and trauma survivors who are forced migrants and other marginalized and disenfranchised groups across South Africa. And her key areas of focus for work include survivors of violence-related trauma, continuous and post-traumatic stress, anxiety, mood, and personality-related impairments. And she provides psychoeducation, trauma debriefing, and psychotherapeutic interventions for individuals, couples, families, and adolescents. Just to remind everyone, please keep your microphones muted, please. Amina also has a particular interest in research around the intersectionality of inequality, identity, and violence. And she's very passionate about advocating against human rights violations and is enthusiastic about breaking the stigma by making information about mental health and mental illness relatable to people via social media platforms, which is a very, very important thing that we need to be doing. I think there is definitely a lot of stigma that surrounds mental health and mental illness, particularly in South Africa, and we need to be taking more steps, sort of combating that and challenging that. And I feel like social media is a very accessible way of doing that. So that is the end of my presentation. Angie, if you could take it over from here, please.
Hi, good morning, colleagues, and good afternoon, rather, and good morning to all our listeners. So I'm a social worker, as already introduced. I work for the Gender Equity Office here at WITS. So the GEO is a holistic and integrated office that deals with all aspects of gender and sexual misconduct on campus. It offers services to the WITS community at large. So the functions of the GEO, I mean, the kind of services that we render are, we receive and investigate complaints about gender and sexual related misconduct. We provide interim and supporting measures to the WITS community, and we provide psychosocial support. This is our arena here. So we provide psychosocial support to the WITS community, meaning students as well as staff. We review existing policies and protocols, and we have an advocacy program that addresses the WITS community as well. And we have a student chapter that focuses on peer support and advocacy. That's all about GBV. So should I go ahead with the services that we offer? Normally have to really. So majorly, let me just explain about signs of the GBV that normally present with clients that we see. So signs of GBV would include physical abuse resulting in body harm or injuries. We see here at times that through the physical abuse, some clients really end up with severe body injuries. Women more especially, they end up with having to terminate pregnancies because of how brutally they've been injured. Sometimes it can be as severe as, where they end up with physical disability because how brutal the gender-based violence can be. We also have signs, emotional abuse as one of the signs of gender-based violence. We have sexual abuse. Here we're talking coerced sex, forced sexual activities, and degrading and shaming, even through social media. We see a lot of technology-facilitated gender-based violence is very prevalent, especially within the institutions of higher learning. And if we talk broader within the larger community, we even see that at schools. And we have restriction of access to financial resources, where a person's access to resources, financial resources, is restricted. It can even be restriction to seeing family members, restriction to being able to visit and friends and families. And we also have psychological abuse through blackmailing, for instance, and manipulation, where the victim is manipulated in many other different forms. So the functions of GEO here would especially serve to be able to help clients to deal with these signs of GBV. I shall, towards the end, give the addresses and contacts that we have that are available to our clients and the largest WITS community.
Thank you, Angie. I think that's really important. We can even maybe put them in the chat box so that people who are here can then access them through the chat box and like kind of copy paste as well. I think it's really important that people do know how to contact the GEO because, like I said, not a lot of people even knew that such an office even exists on campus and that their services are available. So thank you so much for that. Okay, so our next presentation that we have is from Amina.
Hi, can I just go ahead?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. I think we cannot get tired of talking about mental health, mental illness, and trauma. So maybe just to and greetings to everybody who's here. So, but maybe just to start off this discussion, I know that we have often thought about mental health and mental illnesses, and we don't necessarily have an understanding. So I just want to bring a bit of context, excuse me, in. So mental health refers to a person's emotional, social, and psychological well-being, and it speaks to a state of wellness where you have the ability to reflect about yourself or think about yourself as a whole person. It refers to your ability to function positively in your various communities, how you look after yourself, if you're able to realize your potential, cope with different life stresses, and how you interact with other people and make healthy decisions. So when we think about mental health from that perspective, we're able to then kind of think about ourselves and not some of these other definitions that are not really relatable. And then maybe just to differentiate what mental illness is it speaks to a psychological impairment or a disorder that affects individuals' mood, emotions, how they think, and how they behave. And these are typically conditions of the psyche where symptoms can cause clinically significant distress to the individual And these symptoms can collectively inhibit a person's ability to function optimally in their social spaces, their occupational roles, and any other important area of everyday life. So having said that, what is trauma? So psychological trauma can result from any experience where someone has witnessed or been confronted with an event that involves actual or threatened death, serious injury to a person or others. But then what it's done is it's effectively then created intense feelings of fear and sadness and helplessness or horror. So if we're talking about psychological or emotional trauma, we're speaking about damage or an injury to the psyche after living through an extremely frightening or distressing event or a season of events. So if we think about it also in our context of COVID, that there has been so much that has happened over time. It's not just maybe one event that might traumatize you, but maybe the entire season of having so much instability and uncertainty and so much loss that might have resulted in traumatization. So this trauma may result in different challenges or abilities to function or cope normally after the fact or during the fact. And these experiences shift people significantly from an emotional perspective. And if somebody doesn't have sufficient resources to kind of combat the psychological impact, the experiences can then leave a person feeling kind of destabilized and out of equilibrium. So in a state of disequilibrium, which is what we then experience as trauma or being traumatized. So trauma is the response to an event or a series of events. And that's the best way for us to be able to then understand it. So thinking about it from that perspective as well, the various sources of psychological trauma, we can look at COVID and the subsequent grief and loss of people, loss of agency, loss of ability to access different resources. We can look at childhood abuse or childhood neglect. We can talk about physical or emotional or sexual abuse. These can result in psychological trauma. Another one that people typically don't think about is medical interventions. So I like what the previous speaker spoke about, that you experience something and then it might then result in you having to have a medical intervention. And then that might then traumatize you, even though you have the resources to cope with maybe a sexual assault, you know, but then the medical intervention that comes after that, you might not necessarily have the resources to cope with that. But either way, these can contribute to somebody experiencing psychological trauma. And I mean, so I spoke about, you know, natural situations like COVID, but then there's also cultural and intergenerational or historical trauma that does happen when you've lived in a society, maybe which has extensive violence, witnessing acts of violence or terrorism, things like ethnic cleansing, and also oppression that somebody in your family might have experienced. And this then impacts them psychologically. And then we're finding that there is like a sense of intergenerational trauma that is happening with people who are not able to process their trauma and have maybe developed other mental illnesses, are also now raising children, but they don't necessarily have the resources to manage themselves psychologically and to also manage their children psychologically. So I mean, just kind of thinking about how else trauma impacts us. I think one of the biggest things we have to note, so a disclaimer, is that trauma affects individuals in different ways. Not everybody who will experience an event becomes traumatized, firstly. And then if more than one person experiences the same event, there is a possibility that it will affect them differently. So we don't all experience things exactly the same way. But what traumatic experiences essentially do to us is that they shatter our assumptions, so our beliefs in our own personal vulnerability. Traumatic experiences can shatter our views of the self as positive and able to do things. It shatters our belief about the world, that the world is a meaningful and orderly place, something that is predictable and safe. And this then obviously then changes our understanding of how things happen for a reason. So then you're questioning so many things about life. Trauma also shatters or shifts our belief that there is an end to suffering. Because something has happened to you, then you start to experience a sense of suffering. For example, if you're traumatized, and then because you don't have the capability to process that, then you're not sure when suffering can end. And this is typically what can then transcend into some sort of a mental illness. And then one of the big ones is that traumatic events actually shift our trust in other human beings, which is why sometimes it can be very difficult to process trauma. So if the trauma you've experienced has been at the hands of or the will of somebody else, then it doesn't necessarily just allow you, like the privilege, I guess, to only focus on that one type of person. It shifts your entire understanding of human beings and how human beings are safe or unsafe as well. So like I mentioned before, we all respond differently to a potentially traumatic event because we are all not the same. And traumatization is likely to occur when our stressors tend to outweigh our protective factors. So if we're speaking about stressors, we're speaking about factors that contribute to traumatizing a person or making it difficult to process a traumatic event. And then if we're thinking about protective factors, we're looking at factors that protect individuals from being traumatized, and they help to reduce the stress and improve one's ability to cope. So some common stressors I would say include, for example, poverty. That's a very big stressor. Poverty and socioeconomic status, major life changes, things like chronic distress and different types of other illnesses. Another very big one is a previous traumatic exposure. So like I said before, if we look at COVID and we look at how, excuse me, over time, we've had to just keep adjusting, or finding that emotionally and psychologically we're becoming more depleted. And then that then leaves you in a situation where you're much more vulnerable if something else happens and you're not necessarily able to then cope more effectively. And another very big stressor, and this is something that happens a lot in our society, in our context, has to do with childhood neglect and abuse. So when somebody has a history of abuse or neglect, then that kind of works as a stressor as well, because possibly they weren't able to process that kind of event. And then when they come across something else, you're finding that it's feeding into the past trauma that was left unprocessed. So obviously, if somebody then also doesn't have good social and psychological support, then we do look at that as a potential stressor as well, or something that contributes to being unable to process a traumatic event. So if we look at protective factors, for example, and we look at things that help us to cope, things like safety and security are very important. Learning healthy coping abilities are very important as well. Our personal resources, so if, for example, financially we're okay, then typically that works as a protective factor, because then if you need to access support, you do have access to support. But even though not necessarily just placing it on finances, family support and social or community networks are very huge protective factors. So these are the people who are around you that you can relate with, who help to give you a sense of support when you've experienced something that is traumatic. So that can also include religious spaces, other faith-based organizations. And then I think another one that serves as a protective factor, and I think this is a big one also in the South African context, is a sense of agency and political consciousness. So they were looking at how somebody is able to think about their lives, think about possible future prospects and possibilities, and have a sense of agency and control that in the future they'll be able to access that they need access. And I think if we are thinking about how trauma then impacts our mental health, one would then be able to look at, for example, reflecting on our understanding of what mental health is. Trauma then may result in feelings of shame and worthlessness, loss of interest in, activities and people who you previously related to, self-destruction, loss of sense of self, like who are you, what is happening in your life, and trauma can predispose other mental health difficulties or the onset of mental illnesses like PTSD, or, for example, feelings or difficulties related to depression or anxiety. And then I'm thinking that after experiencing, I did mention trauma. I know that we have spoken about PTSD, and PTSD is on a spectrum, and sometimes PTSD can be, so if we're looking at the DSM definition, it includes difficulties experienced after exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violation in various ways, which can cause some sort of a direct a direct exposure. So if, for example, experience something directly, or you saw something happening in somebody's life, or learning that a family member or a relative was exposed to trauma, that can result in some sort of post-traumatic stress. And then what it also then tends to do is it then tends to leave you feeling almost averse to details of the trauma. So somebody might be experiencing post-traumatic stress, for example, if something has happened, and then on TV, they're always showing a lot of violence. Those are some of the signs that you might be experiencing post-traumatic stress. So if we're looking at PTSD and the responses and symptoms, people normally respond to trauma with three clear clusters or symptoms which are related to: one, re-experiencing that trauma in their minds. So sometimes we speak about this as intrusive symptoms. Then two, there's avoidance and numbing. And then the third one is hyperarousal. And I'll speak to how those look in a minute. Because if we then think about it, we move away from how we look at like the medical understanding of it. Other signs or symptoms of post-traumatic stress include things like feeling depressed, struggling to process grief and loss, feelings of hopelessness and helplessness. So other different types of negative thoughts. And then there's also feeling sick physiologically or experiencing body pains. And sometimes when we're not able to kind of look at the mind-body connection, we feel, the body pains, and then we're trying to attend to the body pains, whereas there's a possibility that might be related to a trauma that you experience. And if you're not able to process it emotionally, your body might carry a lot of the stress and the strain of the experience that you've had. And then another common response, and I think this is a big one in our context as well, is substance abuse. Because sometimes when people aren't able to process what has happened to them, they try to numb and they try to escape. And then that's when people then start to use substances to just kind of forget or put themselves in another state of mind that allows them to separate in a way from the traumatic experience. So the three clusters that I spoke about before, the one was about hyperarousal. And sometimes this is experienced like in terms of anger outbursts. So if somebody has experienced a trauma, then you might then start to identify this, or maybe if you experience a trauma, you might start to identify these anger outbursts, difficulties with sleeping, difficulties with concentrating, feeling hypervigilant or always on guard. And also another common one in terms of hyperarousal is easily feeling startled. So like if somebody closes the door, you get a fright. Is another common symptom. And then the second cluster that I spoke about was re-experiencing or having intrusive thoughts. And that normally is in terms of bad memories and flashbacks, sometimes in terms of dreams, so nightmares. And then I mentioned before that sometimes we do have physiological responses. So this is physical responses to a trigger. So if a trigger has to do with a certain area, for example, when you go to that area, you might then start to feel that physiological response. Sometimes it can be physiological and sometimes it can be emotional responses to those different types of triggers. And then the final cluster of symptoms of PTSD that are often experienced refer to the avoidance and the numbing symptoms. So this is being unable to actually feel emotions. So sometimes a person who has experienced a psychological trauma might not have the outbursts. Sometimes they might just not be able to feel emotions, and they might just kind of, I'm sure you've heard people say things like, I don't feel anything, Another one is feeling withdrawn from others. So not wanting to connect with other people. That's a common one. Another one is avoiding any other external reminders of the event. So like I mentioned before, people or places that might remind you of the event that has caused you to be traumatized. And then another big one, so this is why also people who have experienced a trauma sometimes then do struggle with, elements of addiction, for example, is that avoidance and efforts to avoid, if it's memories and thoughts or feelings, but anything that just allows you to move away from yourself. So if these are things that are in your thoughts, these are your memories, these are your emotions, these are your thoughts, and you can't run away from them the way you'd be able to maybe run away from a place that reminds you of the trauma, then you might then start to develop maladaptive methods of coping in an attempt to to kind of escape from yourself. So while there are individual symptoms, as I've mentioned before, there are numerous other impacts that trauma can have depending on what has happened to a person. So these include, for example, inability to work, being unable to provide for your family, which then has financial implications, the impact on the family as a whole. So we're looking at social and environmental implications if something has happened. And then I think a really big one is displacement. So if something happened to you that was very traumatic and you're no longer able to be in that place before, you know, these are some of the impacts that then, you know, further impact the difficulty that you have as a result of the trauma. So you're not able to be where you were physically before the trauma. So while the traumatic event may have happened to just you, for example, it may then impact other areas of your environment. So people who have witnessed what has happened, if there were witnesses, sometimes it's family and friends, they might also then become impacted. If it's a workspace or in a university, for example, your colleagues and other co-workers, and then sometimes a traumatic experience can actually impact an entire community, you know? So the reason why I'm mentioning all of this is because I think sometimes when we think about psychological trauma, we think about it from a very individualized perspective. And sometimes that can be difficult even for the person who's experienced it, because then they feel like nobody knows how I feel. And while it's true that nobody knows exactly how you feel, there are people who may have also been indirectly impacted by what happened to you. And part of healing has to do with human connection. And when we have the understanding that, okay, maybe my sibling or my colleague or someone in my community can relate with this, then that helps a person to be able to then start to process and heal from whatever it is that has resulted in them experiencing a psychological trauma. So yes, trauma does filter into other areas of our lives, and we do have to also be able to look at the individual and the broader context. And in order to be able to understand a person's response to trauma, we must look at the person, their immediate surroundings, and their interactions with their environment as well. And you know, from a developmental perspective, if we're thinking about that, we are impacted by everything in our environment. So it's our internal world, then our external world that has to do with family, school, social spaces, our culture, and the different laws and I guess the systemic and the societal structures that then govern who we are and how we are, and then essentially how we're able to then process different things that we do come across that might result in us being traumatized. So oftentimes when people think about psychological trauma, they then start to think about it from a very extreme perspective. So while I'm not invalidating the experiences of trauma, there are very day-to-day ways that we can identify different elements of trauma in ourselves. And I mean, these are not for diagnostic purposes or anything. This is just for us to be able to reflect on, because a lot of people have experienced some sort of a trauma, and you maybe you experience it earlier on in your life, but you're seeing different types of thought patterns and different types of behaviors in your own life, and you're just not able to kind of pinpoint, like, where did this come from? So for example, difficulty trusting others, it comes from somewhere, whether it comes from neglect, for example, or it comes from abuse or a violation. Even if you're able to look at yourself and say, I really struggle with trusting others, you can try and reflect on your life, you know, from as far as you can remember to date, and try to see what has happened in your life that has shifted your ability to trust in people. Trauma can show up in your life as, you know, toxic relationships and difficulty setting very clear boundaries. So if you feel like you're inferior, maybe because something has happened to you, something significant that has shifted you, you might struggle then to be able to create boundaries with people. And then this might then put you as vulnerable to developing relationships that are very unhealthy. I mean, if we think about things like gender-based violence, for example, I know one of the things that people always ask women who are in intimate partner relationships that are violent, like, why do you keep going back? But we need to be able to understand it from a psychological perspective, that maybe this person has a pattern, a psychological pattern, where they relate well with people maybe who are more controlling. This is something maybe that was learned in early childhood. So they have an affinity to that, and maybe unfortunately that results in them getting into relationships with people who are abusive. When we can understand it like that, we can have much more empathy for that type of a person, because then it's not, oh, they're just consciously thinking of going into abusive relationships. We have an understanding that possibly there is some trauma in their lives, maybe in the form of neglect or emotionally unavailable primary caregivers, for example, that has predisposed them to relating in a certain way with people who tend to neglect them or push them out, or are not, adequately affectionate, emotionally, psychologically, physiologically, and that kind of thing. Another way that trauma shows up in our lives is when we don't have a desire to connect with others. And I think that this is a big one, and this is something that COVID has threatened. So COVID has put us in a space where we're all kind of being very much isolated, right? And while, like I'm saying, this is not diagnostic, but these are just different things for us to be able to think about. When you don't want to connect with others, you need to be able to ask yourself why. What is happening, or what has happened that my desire to interact with other people has now diminished quite significantly? And then you might be able to see that, oh, okay, this might be the reason why. And why this is even a big factor is because, like I said before, different things traumatize different people based on their upbringing, based on protective factors, based on stresses. So you're finding that maybe this COVID experience, the pandemic, has severely traumatized you, and while other people have managed to adapt, you might not have been able to adapt as well because of possibly a trauma that you had experienced before, but just because of how you're possibly struggling to process this series of events, whether it's got to do with the actual physiological nature of COVID, or you've lost somebody, or you've lost a job, or, the people around you don't have as much as they would have had access to. So being able to see, how is it that I'm responding to my environment? How is it that I'm communicating with people? Am I able to express my needs, my feelings, my opinions? These are some of the ways that you can start to reflect, okay, so what is happening with me internally? So having heard all of this, it definitely helps to have potential solutions to mental health difficulties. So obviously, because I work in the mental health sector, I will say that if you're experiencing mental health difficulties, I recommend seeing a professional, because mental health interventions aim to improve psychological well-being. And they do this by reducing the levels of psychological distress, by improving your daily functioning, and then also ensuring that you developed a sense of self, and also an ability to effectively cope with different life stresses. I will also say that even if you're not necessarily experiencing a mental health difficulty, if you have access to any sort of therapeutic process, it's highly recommendable, because then you're going in at a place when you're not in distress. We don't have to wait until we are in distress to be able to then access mental health services. So I would say that accessing psychological or psychosocial support is very important. And when we speak about, for example, psychosocial support, I'm speaking about the interconnection, connecting between yourself and your environment. I'm speaking about how you're developing interpersonal relationships. So sometimes a therapeutic support can be about how to develop healthy relationships, how you interact with your community, what you think about your culture, how your culture has impacted you, and other, various aspects of your social context. And psychosocial support, again, is really important for maintaining good physical and mental health. And like I said before, about how you're able to then cope, how you're supposed to develop ways to then understand yourself when you are in a difficult time. So knowing who you are and having a sense of self helps you so much, because it empowers you so that when you are in a crisis, you have a sense of understanding who you are. So apart from like the formal psychosocial support or psychological support, other really useful strategies that people can kind of engage in on their own would include things like mind-body approaches. So a lot of us know how to, do breathing exercises. Breathing exercises are very useful. Relaxation exercises, things like yoga, things like journaling as well also helps so much to be able to just kind of express yourself. If you have experienced something very difficult, sometimes the thoughts and the emotions are there. Because you're not able to express them effectively, you're finding that they're just kind of getting locked up. So things like journaling helps you to write down a lot of things that you maybe necessarily wouldn't have gone into in everyday life. So while you're busy doing whatever it is that you're busy with in life, you're not thinking about some of these things. And when you take time to sit down and kind of reflect or journal, you're able to then see that, oh, okay, I didn't know that I was thinking about this, or I didn't know that I was feeling this. And what essentially that really helps a lot with is your ability to storytell. And when you have that ability to storytell, you're able to then kind of look into what are the things that have happened to you across the lifespan that then, you know, possibly might have traumatized you, or possibly might have predisposed you to some sort of trauma. And from that perspective, then you're already embarking on some sort of a journey of self-awareness. I think in the interest of time, maybe let me just leave that there.
Thank you so much, Amina. That was a very, very thorough explanation, and I took down lots of notes as well. I also have lots of questions, but before we delve into the question and answer session, Angie, is there anything you would like to add before we do the Q&A?
Yes, just to also add that there's an additional program that as GEO we offer. We also offer a gender sensitization program for perpetrators of gender-based violence. So, and then also we have support groups that we are just starting to support victims, or rather survivors of gender-based violence.
Okay, those are two really great initiatives, particularly the support groups as well. I've run some support groups in the past in conjunction with SADC, and I feel like those are really great ways of sort of helping people deal with their trauma, because you come together and you can sort of collectively talk about your shared experiences, and I think you don't feel as isolated anymore. So that's a really great initiative by the GEO. So I do have some questions that for both of you, but before I kind of delve into my own questions, do the participants have any questions that they'd like to ask? Please feel free to unmute yourself, or even just pop them in the chat box. So I'm just gonna give everybody like a minute. Maybe you can type up whatever questions that you have. Yeah. Or even like raise your hand. I think that's also something you can do if you'd like to speak. Nishka, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, I just have a question for Amina. In terms of how like mindfulness and like meditation can help in terms of dealing with trauma.
So thank you so much for that question. One of the really valuable things that meditation and mindfulness does is, mindfulness helps you to think about yourself and feel what you're feeling. It brings a sense of consciousness to self. So why it's beneficial is that we get so busy in the world, we're always doing stuff, that we find that often we are reacting, we're reacting to whatever it is that is happening externally. When we practice mindfulness or meditation, we tend to be going inwards more. We tend to be silencing a lot of the external voices and what they're saying and how they're impacting us, to actually feel, so, okay, how do I feel when I wake up in the morning? How am I feeling possibly at the end of the day, And when we don't kind of go into those spaces of meditation and silencing, kind of centering ourselves, then we don't know. But unconsciously, all of these things are happening. So if there's fear, if there's confusion and uncertainty or sadness, it's all there. And then we start to learn how to work and continue in life, leaving ourselves behind, So where meditation is really, really good is because it just kind of brings you down. It kind of centers you a lot, and you're able to just kind of feel the different sensations in your body. You're able to hear the different thoughts that you're thinking and the emotions that you have. And then that brings a level of self-awareness where then you can say, okay, I don't know if you ever experienced, but sometimes it happens that, maybe something happened in the day. Maybe you spoke about something and somebody shut it down, for example. And then you start to think, okay, maybe I was wrong. Maybe I shouldn't have done this, And sometimes we brush it off as, okay, they just didn't like my idea. But if you have an upbringing where people often silenced you, this is going to be big, It's a very big thing. So when you then continue, you kind of walk around with this feeling of heaviness, and you're not really sure why. Sometimes you're like, I should just get over it. If you practice things like mindfulness and meditation regularly, it allows you to kind of sit down with yourself and confront some of those feelings. So even if you've discarded it in your mind, your emotions haven't necessarily discarded it. And then you're able to then say, okay, I feel very disempowered today. And then if it means that you have to kind of go back into your day, then you're able to do that. And then it gives you a sense of, okay, I know this is the reason why. It might seem petty, but it's big for me. So that's why it helps you a lot in terms of finding a sense of centering, and then you're able to then process the things that are difficult for you.
Thank you, Amina, and thank you for that question, Nishka. I think mindfulness is definitely something that people need to start exploring a little bit more in terms of just dealing with sort of the day-to-day stresses in life as well. I think it's really important to keep yourself grounded just daily as well. So one of the questions that I had was, you spoke in the beginning of your presentation about psychological impact of trauma. So could you speak a little bit more about what exactly the psychological impact of trauma is and how people can kind of start and combat that?
Okay, so when you've experienced something that has traumatized you, remembering that we are a whole person. So I like to take a holistic understanding of the person. There's the mind, there's the body, there's the emotions, there's your social self, your spiritual self, your academic self, but you're a whole person, right? So when something happens to you that has traumatized you, it doesn't just then impact only your emotions. It impacts, like I said before, it shatters so many of your beliefs about life. And when we don't process just how in depth that is, then those beliefs that have been shattered remain shattered. So one of the ways that I like to explain it is such that if I wear glasses and something happens and my glasses shatter and I pick them up and I put the glasses back on, there's a possibility that I will continue to see the world through those cracks in my glasses. If I can't replace the glasses, which is like getting psychological help, then I'm wearing the same glasses, but now they're shattered, So the psychological impacts are very broad. They can impact us cognitively, for example, difficulties concentrating, the difficulties processing information, difficulty being able to get through a certain amount of work that you were able to get through before. Emotionally, it can impact how you relate with people, whether you're afraid to then communicate and connect with other people. Physiologically, if there was a violation, for example, to the body, then you're very conscious of your body. So the impacts are very, very, very broad. And it depends with different people. But more than anything, it's about kind of recognizing that, okay, this area of my life has been impacted. So if it's financially, emotionally, physiologically, psychologically, academically, environmentally, whichever area has been impacted, then you look into that and you can see, okay, fine. As a result of this happening, this is where I am in this particular area in my life. So it is very, very, very broad, the psychological impacts. And again, that one thing can impact two people in totally different ways.
Yeah, it is very subjective. My next question is for Angie. So in your presentation, you mentioned technology facilitated GBV. Could you explain that to us a little bit more? Because I think that's like this is like the first time I've kind of heard of the concept of gender-based violence being facilitated through technology. So if you could explain that and tell us a bit more about that, how it's kind of how it happens and how people can safeguard themselves against it.
Technology facilitated GBV relates mostly to social media, where people are using either phones, internet as the platforms to facilitate gender-based violence. I'll give here for an example where they can a person can circulate a nude picture of their boyfriend or girlfriend or their partner that they had gotten hold of, for instance, even without the consent, but then they circulate that to cause shame and to ruin the reputation of the victim. So that is technology facilitated. You would remember as well in the recent years where there has been a girl who in the Limpopo who because of that ended up ending her life. And if you have been reading the headlines in the news, that was very painful. So technology facilitated gender-based violence is becoming very, very common, especially amongst the youth. It's very common in institutions of higher learning.
Thank you, Angie. Yeah, I agree with you. I think it definitely has been becoming more prevalent. I think it's also called revenge porn. I think when the person's nudes are leaked by their partner, that's also a term that it kind of have come across. I think Mia has a question for us. I'm just gonna wait for her to put it in the chat box. In the meantime, a question that's open for both of you. How does one deal with PTSD? And also if you have any like short-term tips for someone who is kind of going through post-traumatic stress disorder. So how can they deal with that? And what are some short-term tips that you can give them?
Okay, so maybe I can go first. I will always say, please seek mental health support. Sometimes we overlook the complexity of the trauma that you've experienced. Like I said before, it shatters a lot of our beliefs. And maybe even if we think, okay, it might just be one thing. If you get access to professional support, they help you to walk through whatever it is that you've experienced and help you to unpack it. So you can, sometimes what happens when a person goes into therapy, they go in with one thing and then they discover so many other different areas of their life that they were not able to process certain things, different ways of understanding themselves. So I will always say, try to get professional support. There are different organizations and ways that you can access some of them. But then I will also say that if somebody is experiencing PTSD, for example, finding different things that bring a sense of center as a kid are really, really, really helpful. So if I don't know if you've ever heard of, for example, therapy. I know things a lot. A lot of military veterans you'll find are being given like a service dog, for example. And this is because there's something about kind of getting that sense of security and safety that brings a sense of calming, which is very useful, which is very helpful. But it's not necessarily just something like that. You can find different things for yourself that communicate to you that the world is safe. So if it's interacting with other people who you trust and you love, who you feel like you can be open with, you don't feel like you have to present yourself a certain way, then that is something that you can do as a support system. I think the difficult thing about PTSD, for example, is triggers are just about anywhere, right? And one of the difficult things about a trigger is that when you become triggered, then you don't know what to do with yourself, you know, and you go into a state of distress. But when you have different faculties and areas where you're able to find a sense of grounding and security, then it helps you, one, to be safe enough to feel triggered, to be able to express yourself, and then to just kind of come back to a space where you acknowledge that, okay, fine, this is what has happened and this is what it triggered, and you're able to then kind of go there. So, I mean, there are different things, you know, before I mentioned meditation and grounding techniques. Breathing exercises are also really useful when you go into distress. Sometimes just using your different senses to see something that is calming, or remember a smell, or hear something that is calming. So even certain types of music, for example, can bring a sense of calming. But what that does is it manages the state of distress. You know, it might not necessarily deal with what is underlying that, but it helps you to just kind of find a sense of this calming and equilibrium from the state of distress.
Thank you, Amina. Angie, would you like to add anything to that?
Yes, I would add to what Amina has just said. Sadly, the problem is that with emotional and psychological trauma, they tend to be undermined. Like Amina said, they tend to be overlooked. And I think it is quite crucial and important as individuals to know the symptoms, what they are, so that we are able to identify them for what they are and be able to seek professional help. Because especially within our Black African communities, these symptoms are not easily identified for what they are, and sometimes they could be interpreted in cultural terms, and sometimes somehow they are missed, and the person does not get the help that they necessarily need for them to be able to come to terms with this impact. So I would, recommend that platforms like this are regular to allow our student community and even the larger community to be able to know what these symptoms are, the post-traumatic stress disorder, because with a physical injury, it is quite overt that if I cut my finger, you can imagine, you can see, and if I go to the doctor, they can check the depth of the wound and how they need to manage it. But with psychological and emotional trauma, it's quite different, because sometimes even with emotional trauma, you can't even measure as to how deeply wounded the person has been. But yet the symptoms, if as a professional you can pick them up, you know that these are very severe symptoms. And I would touch a little bit on how to help the loved ones. Usually within families or with loved ones, the loved ones can react to erratic behavior or irrational thoughts, but without actually understanding that these are some of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And in that way, families can draw apart and can be destroyed, and the person can end up even losing the very same family support that they need the best, because the symptoms are not identified for what they are, and the person does not receive the professional help that they deserve. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. So Mia does have a question for us. She says, thank you for the presentation, very informative. I would like to ask, how would you be able to assist someone, such as a family member or friend, who is experiencing trauma but is perhaps unaware of it or is avoiding/numbing the effects of it? How do you assist without imposing a weakness onto their character? I think this is a very, very important question, because we do sometimes see our loved ones dealing with things or in a situation that isn't the healthiest for them. So how can we assist the family member or friend who firstly might not be aware of the fact that they are experiencing a traumatic event, or who might be avoiding or numbing the effects of that trauma?
So I really like what Angie already said about knowing what the symptoms are, knowing what the signs are. You know, that's the first step, you know. And then I think it's very difficult to go into somebody's trauma for them, you know, because you don't know when you see the numbing, whether it's self-harm or it's destructive behavior. When you see that, the normal response is to kind of respond to the behavior, to respond to the conduct, right? And already that person is using that as some sort of a defense against themselves, because they're trying to protect themselves from whatever they're feeling. So firstly, what I would say is get as much information as you can get. So try to find out, okay, this is what is happening and it might be linked to this. So speak to anybody who's knowledgeable about mental health difficulties so that you can get a sense of insight into, okay, this might be related to this, you know. And then secondly, when you go to a person, remember that that person is already feeling whatever you're feeling about that person. If it's a sense of sadness or whatever, they're probably already feeling that much more amplified. So it has to be in a very, very safe and secure way. It has to be in a way where you're introducing the topic, which is not confrontational, for example. So if you say something like, I noticed that you're drinking so much more now, already you're bringing up the behavior, and the person is now kind of prone to respond to the behavior. So it's about your approach and what you say and how you say it. But creating a safe space and asking for permission, for example, like, do you mind if we speak about this? Because I have kind of noticed that this has been happening before, and I really would love to be able to hear from you what is going on, if you feel comfortable enough talking to me about it. Sometimes we assume that our siblings, our family members, and our friends actually want to talk to us about it. Sometimes trauma comes with a sense of shame, you know? So even you opening up the space might then remind them of what has happened and the shame or guilt that is associated with it. So allowing an open conversation and saying, look, if you're not comfortable speaking to me about it now, I care about you, reaffirm them, revalidate them, and then open up the space that if you don't feel comfortable speaking about this now, I'm available anytime that you want to speak about it. Because it's giving them the courage to kind of go there themselves and the space, and no pressure to actually deal with it now, you know. So I think that generally that is the easiest way. People need safe spaces to be vulnerable. If you've experienced something like a violation, your vulnerability has already been taken away. So when somebody comes in with maybe knowing too much or sounding like they're knowing too much, that can remind them of what it feels like to not have like their own personal space and your own agency. So it is about informing yourself also, so that maybe you're not even bringing in some of the stereotypes, and then allowing them to guide the conversation, allowing them to direct you in what you want to be able to speak about. I think that would be the best way to provide support to a friend or a family member.
Thank you, Amina. Angie, would you like to add anything?
Yes. Usually the person in question would have so much defense that for the family member, perhaps it would not be you know, the person will not receive their advice so well, because their defense mechanisms would be so high, you know, because you're not going to be a professional to them. So they would be seeing you as a sister, a bigger sister, or a small sister, perhaps is, you know, wants to talk too much. It's even difficult at times for the parents. So usually when there has been an event that has happened, or when there has been a drinking episode. And if you bring the issues up, it will not be well received because the defense mechanisms just go so high. And it depends on whether the symptoms ranging from small, medium to severe, symptoms. So when the symptoms are even severe, where the behavior is very uncontrollable, in South Africa, unfortunately, even, for an adult, you cannot even force them to go and receive help unless it's a very life-threatening situation. There's only few organizations that I know of where they can actually come and accost the person to force them to go and receive help. But otherwise, from a legal point of view, you cannot actually force them to go and receive help unless they have come to terms with the understanding that they actually do need to receive help.
Thank you, Angie. Yeah, I think it's an important thing to keep in mind that while we would like to help our loved ones to the best of our abilities, you can't force someone to seek help if they're not ready to seek help. But that doesn't mean you give up on them. You have to remain patient and show them that, keep reminding them that the help is available and that they do have a support system. Thank you for the question, Mia. Does anybody have any other questions? If you do, please pop them in the chat box. We are running over time. So I'm just going to wait like 2 minutes to see if anybody has any questions. If not, then we will log off. But in the meantime, one thing that I kind of wanted to ask both of you was about generational trauma. And that's something that I thought was very interesting and very important for us to discuss, particularly in a South African context, given our traumatic history. How do you process generational trauma, and how do you kind of start dealing with, firstly, what is generational trauma? Secondly, how do you kind of process it, and how do you deal with generational trauma?
I think Amina had touched on it. If perhaps you could explain on that. You mentioned it as generational trauma. So some instances we do talk about intergenerational trauma. So maybe even that difference, if there is any, Amina, if you can touch on.
Okay, so in the interest of time, maybe let me frame it like this: that in bringing it into the South African context, when you've experienced a history of oppression, history of violence, there is ongoing violence. This country has been identified as one of the more violent countries in the world, right? So when people have been oppressed in one way, and it's impacted them psychologically, what it does, and I mean, there's lots of theories about intergenerational trauma, but what it does effectively, we're thinking about it from a social setting and a family setting, is if I'm not well because of something that has happened to me, and then I have children, it's like the psychological and emotional resources that I have might not be efficient enough or adequate enough to be able to support a child in the way they need to be. And I'm not saying that parents who have experienced trauma are then incapable of raising healthy children. No, I'm just saying that when we experience trauma, it shifts our lives significantly. So if we are traumatized, it shifts our lives significantly. And then we take that shift and we continue into life like that, right? So if, for example, let me give an example. Let's say, for example, my grandmother was sexually violated in a certain way, maybe by a certain type of person. Then she'll have perceptions about that certain type of person and that certain type of act. Then she is raising another child maybe a girl child. And with her experiences, especially when they're unprocessed, that is what she's going to take into her learning of, her teaching of, interacting with the daughter, for example. If there's paranoia, if there's anxiety, if there's depression, that child is now being raised in an environment which is highly prone to, for example, let's say some of the outbursts, for example, some of the learnings or teachings about everyday life, like you can't go outside of this time, you can't speak to certain types of people, that kind of thing. And what it does is it then frames another person's state of mind that these are the things that are dangerous, for example. So I'm speaking about it very casually and like from a very surface perspective, because this is how trauma gets passed on from one person to the next. If, for example, somebody is raised in a family where there is domestic violence, they are exposed to violence, then we start to understand that violence is an integral part of life. We then start to see how they might not necessarily be violent in this space, but they might be violent in other spaces. So in that way, that type of violence gets passed on, and we have lines where, and I mean, we hear it a lot in our cultures that, no, these types of people, they always beat up their wives or they always beat up their partners. Where did they learn it? They learned something dysfunctional because of being raised, for example, in a home that is predominantly dysfunctional. Even things like substance use. If you're not raised with adequate resources to cope, and you see that, oh, okay, alcohol helps us to cope, then that is something that you then might start to develop, even unknowingly. And even if we think situations where you have, and this happens quite a lot, you'll have a family where maybe a boy child was raised and the father maybe used to beat up the mother. Then he gets into a relationship and he beats up his partner as well. And you ask yourself, but if you saw that happening in your home, why are you replicating exactly the same thing? Because level of unconscious learning, even though this hurts this person, there's a level of unconscious learning through modeling that the person has now developed. And then you're finding them acting it out in a very similar kind of way, even though they personally know what this did to them in their lives, So that is a kind of unconscious learning. When you're talking about trauma from it's an unconscious of learning that happens from one generation to the next because of some of the experiences. I think maybe that is a roundabout way of explaining.
I mean, if I could just add a little bit to that, with that learning that has happened, having learned to be violent within the African context, then that as well sometimes gets interpreted, in cultural terms, where there is a phenomena where they start saying that, no, a person has been cursed, or they're carrying a curse from the previous generation. It needs to be terminated through certain rituals. So that could be a topic for another day.
Absolutely. And I like the way you've put that, because we do then start to think about it like that, and it's very common that then we say, oh, these people need cleansing. And I mean, I'm not pouring water on cultural activities at all. And I know that that's not what Angie is trying to do either. But then we start to see that there is a type of learning that happens, even if it's unconsciously. Then we then start to see across generations, or even in communities where you find that there's so much violence in this community, but you've seen it here. And I mean, a common one also, I've just reminded is, things like vigilantism. We all know that this type of violence is not productive. But when we look at what happens when you don't engage in that violence, because of the collective trauma of instability, not being able to trust, for example, police forces and that the systemic stuff, people start to embody a type of violence because they're like, this is what's going to solve my problems. And if we then look at the problem here as the vigilantism, and we ignore like that collective trauma that has happened because of not being able to trust state organs, having people in your community who are not responding well when you ask them to, or like just maybe let's use the word delinquents, or people who don't, who who don't follow the law, you know. When people experience that for an extended period of time and it's not being attended to, then we start to see something else. But even things like vigilantism is something that I would say is a response to a collective trauma, because people don't know what to do. They don't know how else to sort things. And they actually saw that, you know what, if we do this thing, it eliminates the problem, you know. So these are some of the things that when we have conversations about intergenerational trauma, we have to be able to have as well. That there's cultural aspects, there's community aspects, but there's so many things that are happening, not just internally within a person, that get passed on from one person to the next.
Thank you, Amina, and thank you, Angie. I think we're going to have to cap it to here. We have gone a bit over time, so I am incredibly sorry, but thank you both so much for staying and answering the questions. And to all of our participants as well, thank you so much for joining. If you would like the, sorry, I don't know what it is.